I'm here with Vegan Gangs, or Richard, one of the most well-known vegan influencers, and we're catching you at a very, very good time because you're in the midst of a little bit of a firefight with one of the most well-known YouTubers and ex-vegans, Cosmic Skeptic or Alex O'Connor. And did you see the most recent video he posted about vegan bodybuilders? I kind of feel like he was going after you. I saw. I haven't seen the response yet. Jeremy shared it with me. But just tell us a little bit about the vegan bodybuilder argument and just the history with Cosmic Skeptic Alex O'Connor and why you feel so
Yeah.
strongly that we need to
So
call him out.
so he was arguing that vegan bodybuilders are eating more calories than an average person, say like, somewhere between 3 to 500 more per day. So because they're eating more, they're going to take up more agricultural resources, therefore that's going to lead to more animal deaths. Now the problem with that argument is, one, you're assuming agriculture causes more animal deaths than would naturally occur in the wild. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know why I'd accept that. Animals kill other animals. They fight for survival. They die of starvation. There's, hot and cold seasons where they
Yep.
might, not get water or they'll freeze to death. So a lot of deaths happen in nature. I don't know why I would assume that more deaths would occur in agriculture. So it is very likely fewer deaths occur in agriculture, and in that case you would be actually motivated to ecologically take over and get rid of wilderness and build more human habitation like farmland, cities, things like that, because that would actually lead to more animal deaths. There's a few other problems with the argument, but that's the main criticism. Alex, I am not really convinced the guy was ever vegan, really, at any point, especially given his excuses for quitting, which essentially amounted to "I pooped my pants." And I'm not even kidding. His excuse was literally "I pooped my pants." You can look it up. He made a video going over his excuse. Basically, he's had IBS his whole life. I don't know why veganism triggered his IBS in particular. He would have already known what foods, trigger his IBS before. If you're non-vegan, you're omnivorous. You eat all the foods. So if he's had this problem his whole life, how would he have not figured out by now what foods trigger his IBS, what don't, what foods to avoid? So it's the most nonsensical excuse. And again, he's been ducking a debate with me. I actually talked to a guy who knows him personally,
Hmm.
who brought me up. And as far as I know, Alex said something along the lines of "I'm crazy," and then uh, basically hand waved away the idea of debating me. But if he ever wants to debate me, I'd ask him to name the trait that's lacking in animals that, if lacking in human beings, would make it justified to kill and eat human beings so you don't poop your pants. Like it's just ridiculous. All these ex-vegans are just total clowns.
Yeah. So I want to put a pin in this name the trait challenge because I like that and I think we should discuss that a little bit. But I'll just say, um, Alex is an example of what I've seen from extraordinarily intelligent people for virtually my entire adult life. Because I went vegan around the time I became an adult, around 18 years of age. And
I
I
think
became
calling
vegan.
him extraordinarily intelligent is a bit of a reach,
Oh, come
personally.
on. You don't think he's a smart guy?
No.
I mean, I haven't
Um,
seen a huge amount of his content, so maybe I'm wrong about this, but I have seen. I heard a little bit of a conversation he had with Sam Harris about objective morality. I've seen some of the stuff, even the stuff he's done on veganism and factory farming. I mean, he makes intelligent arguments for veganism. The problem is, even intelligent people, when they engage in cognitive dissonance avoidance or trying to justify something that can't be justified, they struggle. And that kind of is what happened to me when I was 18 years old. I was someone who loved eating meat. My dad performed experiments on animals, and I wanted to believe everything our family was doing. All the money our family had used to support ourselves through my entire life was ethically justified. And I did everything I could to try and explain and rationalize and excuse the misconduct against the animals. After I read Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. I thought, this is a very provocative argument. It has to be wrong because, I mean, the first sentence of the book is, this is about the tyranny of human over non-human animals. And I just thought, wait, we can't be living in a tyranny. That just can't be the case. And I found myself struggling to find solid arguments. And I think that Alex is just engaging in what a lot of really smart people do, which is very, very poor rationalization for something that can't be rationalized. And I think you're right that there's a lot of violence in nature. And the real question is, if instead of farmland for human consumption, it had just been a forest, what would have happened to the animals? You're basically making the point that scientists make all the time, which is you have to look at not just what happens in this particular changed environment, but what the base rate of suffering was, what the base rate of X was. And this is true of every scientific experiment. This is why you have controls, right? You have a control variable. But in this case, Alex is completely ignoring a basic proposition in the scientific method because he's trying to rationalize his own conduct, which is tough. So that's where I'm very much in agreement with you. Where I disagree with you is I don't think Alex is a bad person. I don't think rationalization makes someone unintelligent or even malicious. I think it's just something everybody engages in. And I think we engage in it too. And I think that the arguments he made...
I'll stop you right there.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so just because everybody engages, let's say like there's some sort of trait about humanity that's universal where we all have cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's anything to be excused. We could all be racist. We could all be homophobic. That doesn't mean like, these sorts of character flaws that we have should just be excused. And you're still a bad person. It just means it's universally true that everybody's a piece of crap. So, Alex is a terrible person. Anybody who engages knowingly in an animal holocaust is a terrible person. Yeah. And even if the rationalizations for it are universal, that would just mean everyone is universally a piece of crap.
A terrible person. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is kind of my sense is that's generally your view of human beings. Is that fair to say? That you think most humans are pieces of crap?
Yeah, I would say I'm a misanthrope, and most human beings are terrible. I think when you see tragedies like the Holocaust, I think it really shows that most human beings have qualities that are extremely dangerous. So it's hard to trust other people when tragedies like that can occur.
Yeah, I mean, that's a fair point. And it's not just the Holocaust. If you look at the history of human civilization and even the human species, not only the way we've wiped out other animals, and we've been doing this not just for the last 10,000 years, but tens of thousands of years. You go back 100,000 years to kind of the period where Homo sapiens first was coming into existence as a distinct species from Homo habilis and Australopithecus, basically just wiped out all the other homos, all the other human species were wiped out by us. And then we started traveling all over the world to places like Australia, Asia, the Americas. And everywhere we go, you see extinctions left and right. Not at the scale we're seeing right now. I mean, this is a scale of extinction that hasn't been seen for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years in the planet's history. But even you go back, to the early kind of prehistoric era in human history, once we became tool-using, cooperating apes, we're able to take down all the animals. And we did with impunity, and we caused enormous suffering. My hope comes from this, that the same mechanisms psychologically that cause human beings to do horrible things, if we just tweak them towards compassion rather than violence and assertion of power and fear-mongering, they can inspire human beings to do amazing things, right? And religion is an example of this. I used to be someone who is super anti-religion, but then I found out about religious traditions that have led people to engage in enormous sacrifices to support their communities, even to help animals. You look at the Jains and ancient Buddhists and even modern Buddhists, like Chinese Buddhism in, at least in the United States. I'm not as familiar with Chinese Buddhism in China. And I say this as someone who's an atheist. I mean, I believe in Buddhism from a philosophical perspective, but I'm not someone who believes in any sort of metaphysical law that requires me to be kind to animals. But you look at all the Chinese Buddhist temples in the Bay Area, they're all vegan. And they teach every single person who comes into their temple that we have an obligation to be vegan and not to hurt any sentient being. And that's the same groupthink in many ways that causes human beings to engage in atrocities. It's just who we are as a species. We're social animals. We tend to do what the other members of our tribe do. That's not good or bad. That's just who we are. We just have to point it in the right direction. And what do you think about that?
Well, like you mentioned, we evolved from apes, and a lot of our behaviors are very ape-like. We're extremely tribal. And I think a lot of people think without using much logic. They think very emotionally. And even when they do try to use logic, they have very motivated reasoning that's based on, emotions. That's why so many people, you can still like argue with them till your face goes blue about veganism, but then they'll come up with excuses like I poop my pants so I can't be vegan. So like I don't have faith in religious institutions like Buddhism or Jainism. I've seen where some of the stuff leads. I know in places like Tibet, there's like child pedophile rapist cults within Buddhism.
It's true.
Yeah. What's his name? He was like kissing a boy on live TV.
The Dalai Lama.
Yeah. Like,
yeah, it was weird. It was a very weird video.
Yeah.
Because it's not, kissing him straight on the lips too. And it kind of
Yeah.
non-consensual. The kid is kind of like, what the hell's going on? Yeah. It was a little weird.
Yeah.
I will say in his defense, it struck me as being more just creepy older guy who doesn't understand social norms.
No,
than
he
pedophilia
wants to have
me,
sex
but-
with children. It's pedophilia.
Wow.
He comes
Yeah,
from a
evidence to back that up.
lineage. He comes from a lineage of pedophile cults.
Really?
The Buddhist monks in Tibet, they're basically like a ruling class. And again, it's very ape-like hierarchical structures, and people are prone to take advantage of their power. And again, like I've just seen so much stupid crap coming from people who come from communities that are supposedly trying to mean well, like Gandhi, for instance. He came from like a Sikh Jainist community, and this is a guy who condoned the Holocaust. He wouldn't advocate for any kind of armed resistance against the Holocaust, and said Jews should just mass sacrifice themselves and kill themselves, like leap off of cliffs in protest of the Holocaust. He took advantage of women and sexually abused and raped even his own family members, and he was also a massive racist. So these religious institutions, any kind of hierarchical institutions like these, I don't think they're necessarily a pathway towards anything good. I think what you're slowly seeing is an evolution of human consciousness where we're just ever so slowly inching forward and including more and more beings within our basically tribe. Again, humans are very tribal, and at first you saw like only white people, only black people, only Asians kind of getting along with each other, but now things are starting to broaden, and racism is still extremely prevalent, but it's slowly dying away. And hopefully animal rights is another thing that is slowly growing, and we include animals into our tribe.
So that sounds very hopeful. If you think that's true, why don't you think, whether we call them religious institutions or even just secular organizations? I mean, to me, I agree with you that a lot of these traditional religions have not been the best, and even a lot of our heroes through history, like Gandhi, made some very serious mistakes, and maybe modern heroes too. But over time, we have seen these institutions evolve. You look at kind of the Catholic Church now and their openness to LGBT people, which is amazing to me. Their openness to animal rights, which is also amazing. Pope Francis is probably the best pope in the history of the Catholic Church. Look at how Buddhism, even Chinese Buddhism, I mean, the inception of veganism within Chinese Buddhism in the United States is a fairly recent phenomenon, right? 20 years ago, a lot of them were vegetarian, but even vegetarianism really wasn't a requirement. Today, if you go to any of the temples the Berkeley Buddhist Temple, which I've been to, Buddha Gate in East Bay, which I've also been to. They're all vegan, and they're all moving towards that direction because as there's more scientific evidence and more deliberation and thought on what we should be doing to animals, the Buddhist monks and the parishioners themselves are all recognizing, hey, this isn't really consistent with our values. If we actually believe all sentient beings should be protected from suffering, how can we possibly eat that? That's great. Why isn't this a hopeful story rather than a sad story?
Well, I do think there's hope, but I'm also realistic, and I think all of this should be taken with trepidation. I just think that especially in large institutions, there's a lot of possibility for harm. Like if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, they defended Nazis, they helped protect Nazis after the war. The amount of sexual abuse that's occurred in the Catholic Church over the years has been tremendous. And if you look at the changing culture within the Catholic Church and the new Pope being more friendly to LGBTQ, it doesn't seem to be from any kind of it doesn't seem to be from any kind of new understanding within the church that what have we been doing all this time? It's more from social pressure where people are kind of fed up with the church and they're realizing that if they want to keep getting money and be rich billionaires that don't have to pay any taxes on the money they're being given because they have religious exemptions, that they're going to have to change and adapt. So, things are pretty cynical like that. It's just the way things are. I just don't have much faith in large institutions. Things like the Catholic Church, even our own governments, they're not really geared towards defending people's rights. They're more like the risk of just totalitarianism is just ever present. And it's something that you have to be aware of and fight against at every step. And if we just have this, view that, everybody wants to do good, everybody's good deep down, I don't believe that. And I think that's dangerous thinking that can lead to, like, again, another Holocaust. If you look at a lot of the journals and personal writings of people who were living in Nazi Germany all the time, everyone believed, okay, it couldn't get this
Can't
bad.
be that bad.
Okay,
Yeah,
it couldn't
you're
get
right.
this bad. It
No,
couldn't
you're
get this
100% right.
bad. Yeah.
Including a lot of people who ended up dying. They said, oh, no, they can't possibly want to kill us all. This is Germany. We've been here for hundreds of years and we're upstanding members of society. They would never just send us to a concentration camp and kill us and our children. And that's exactly what happened. So,
yeah,
you might be right. Maybe my thinking is not just stupid, but dangerous,
Yeah, and I mean, in China, look at what happened. Under Mao Zedong, almost 100 million people got killed. And this is another example of, like, tribalism. There's just this mass hysteria around this cult of personality. And he was able to just manipulate the masses into this crazy idea of communism where people were ratting out each other's neighbors and forcing each other to starve to death. So, yeah, people are dangerous, and you should just be ever aware of just the way people are very tribal, the way they think, and they're kind of just, most people are kind of going through life pretty aimlessly, and they're very, very prone to just manipulation and hysteria.
Have you seen The Three Body Problem yet?
No.
You should watch at least the first episode if you're interested in the Cultural Revolution. I won't give it away. I don't want to spoil this for all the folks listening and for you. But yeah, it's a pretty sadly accurate depiction of what you're talking about that Mao did in the 1960s and 70s. My family was affected by that. So my grandfather fled China in 1949 with his wife and a very young baby. And then had my mom, I think a year after they fled. They got on a rocky boat because my grandfather was I think at the time he was a captain in the KMT, the Nationalist Army, which was supported by the West. We call them democratic. That's not entirely accurate because Chiang Kai-shek, the communists were terrible, but so were the nationalists. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator who murdered all of his opponents. And most people don't know, even after they took over Taiwan, Taiwan was not a democracy until like 1993. He ruled that
Hmm.
place with an iron fist and killed all his adversaries. My grandfather, when he fled in 1949, he fled because he saw the writing on the wall, what was going to happen to everyone who disagreed with Mao. And he didn't want his wife, his children to be possibly murdered by this guy who was going after all his adversaries. It was already happening starting in 1949. And the most sad thing is he left his little brother behind because he couldn't go back to their home city and collect his entire
Yeah.
family. They're basically the nationalist army had been pushed to the border basically, and the U.S. Army was providing some ships and stuff and like boats, and people were just scrabbling together whatever ship they could get to get across the Taiwan Strait. And he had to make a decision: do I stay and try and protect my entire family, or do I go and just save my wife and my one child? And he chose the latter. And my grandfather was a hard man. I mean, he was like a very grim, serious guy. I never saw him laugh. He barely ever smiled, didn't ever show any emotion. But when he went back to China after 40 years, because his brother like got sent to some sort of camp, never had the opportunities he had, was like shriveled up and just small because so many people were malnourished in China in that
Yeah.
time period. And you're right. It's because you had this big institution that theoretically was about trying to do the right thing. I mean, Mao talked a good game about protecting the peasants and the working class and making sure there wasn't abuse of power. And then he did exactly what he said everyone else was doing to his own people. But
Yeah.
I will say, and maybe I'm falling victim to the pathology of dangerous thinking. And it's weird for me to say this given what Mao did to my own family. I think Mao was a good person. I think he was trying to make
He
the
was
world a better
not.
place.
He was not.
I think so. It depends a lot on what you mean by good person. What I mean by good person is in Mao's own internal worldview. When he got up every morning, when he went to sleep at night, even when he was telling the Red Guards to send people to camps or telling them, and the Red Guards were like the socialist cadres of young people were going around marauding the entire countryside, basically taking out anyone who was opposing the ruling party. I'm pretty confident he thought he was doing the right thing all the way through. That he thought,
No.
you don't think he was?
He was a psychopath who was obsessed with power.
Those two
If you
things
just
aren't
look at,
inconsistent. Sometimes people who are
well,
doing
they
the
are.
right thing are also psychopaths or obsessed with power.
No. Those two things are consistent. If you're trying to do the right thing, that's altruism. If you're a psychopath who's just obsessed with power, everything's in your own self-interest, and everything he did was clearly in his own self-interest. He was killing all political adversaries, killing anybody who dissented. These mass starvations, I think, worked in favor of him because it made people extremely terrified to ever oppose the government, and it kept the population weak, made it so they couldn't fight back. And just like when you look at his personal life, like he wouldn't brush his teeth, and his explanation was, well, tigers don't brush their teeth. He kept a harem of like young girls, many of them underage. And like this guy sexually assaulted and raped I don't know how many women and young girls. Like this was a evil person.
Which was true. I mean, for the record, not to defend the conduct and not to make the same mistake that you pointed out earlier about Alex O'Connor, I will say that was pretty common in China, having multiple young women. I mean, that's not fucked up, but having
Well,
multiple concubines. So, for example, my grandmother and my grandmother's mom were kind of quasi concubines at a very young age. So it's not to excuse his conduct, but I think that judging people by modern standards, we can see things as more awful and more psychopathic than they actually were. And I'm not even saying Mao wasn't a psychopath. I think there were psychopathic tendencies in a lot of what he did. But I think even what you say about self-interest, the problem with tyranny and atrocities usually is not someone who is actually malicious. It's someone who's so enthusiastic about his ideology and really truly believes what he's doing is altruistic. Like in his worldview, even when he was killing people, well, it's for some greater good. And that's how he not only justified his own conduct, but inspired other people to join him in mass killings. I don't think it was some manipulation on his part. I think he was a true believer who thought what he was doing was going to save the working class. He just didn't realize he had become the same monster he was trying to fight. No?
yeah, no, I don't think so.
You don't think that's true?
When you do
Do you think that's true of Hitler? Do you think
What?
Hitler was a true believer, or do you think he was manipulating people?
No, I think it's a bit of both.
Little
So Hitler seemed to have become radicalized by some people in the political party that he became a part of, where he basically started believing that Germans were part of like some alien species called the Aryan race. So he was probably racist and anti-Semitic beforehand. And he has a really weird family history too, where he was actually likely part Jewish,
Yeah, I've
and
heard that.
that might have been where some of his shame of Jews came from. It's like some like weird narcissist thing where he couldn't like accept the fact that he's Jewish, so
Yeah.
he like lashed out or something. But it seems that he got a little bit radicalized, even more than he was before joining the party. And like you can look at what happened in the Holocaust. They're actually diverting resources away from the war just so that they could kill more Jews.
Yeah.
So some of this just seems like insane, pathological, where he just wanted to murder as many people as possible. I wouldn't say Hitler has any redeemable qualities, neither does Mao.
So here's a question for you. I think most people would probably agree with you and me that whatever we say about their intentions, that these people did awful, vile things. Most people do not make the leap to the atrocities that are happening to animals today. What do you think it is about you that allowed you to make that leap? Do you think it was just logic? And not just you, but other people who become vegan and start recognizing that, the atrocities that inflict on animals are very similar to what Mao did to my people back in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah, so I think veganism requires a lot of honesty to an extent where you have to be very critical of yourself.
Hmm.
A lot of people don't like the idea of accepting the fact that they supported a Holocaust.
Yeah.
So, and they get it very triggered when you even use the word Holocaust. Like, they're animals. How can it be a Holocaust? Like, I just hear it all the time, and then I get accused of being anti-Semitic because I even compare it to the Holocaust. But yeah, it requires a level of honesty that I think most people don't have, and I've had this theory, like Gary Yourofsky. He's gone to many like high school and I think some college campuses to give speeches. And he said a lot of minorities, black people, gay people are much more receptive to the vegan message. So people who have been through a lot of troubles, that have been targeted, that have been oppressed, they seem to understand the message a bit more.
Hmm.
I think when people are in a position of privilege where everything is kind of fed to them on a silver spoon, so to speak, they don't really have to go through abuse much.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of develop this sense of self that, I'm a great person. Everyone treats me nice. There's no way I could do anything bad.
Bad. Yeah.
So I think there's something about being oppressed or abused where you start to question, I don't know, your own sort of worth. Where
Mm-hmm.
if you're an abused person, you kind of try to rationalize it. Maybe I'm a piece of crap and I'm not that great. And I think that sort of idea makes it a little easier to confront the fact that you did something horrible. Whereas
Yeah.
people who've been privileged their entire lives, they've never been mistreated. Why would they ever think that they're worth less? That, I'm a bad person. I'm a bad person. So yeah, I think that's one of the reasons why veganism was just so easy for me to accept. After seeing one of Gary's speeches, I went vegan right then and there. I've
Uh-huh.
never had a hard time accepting that I'm doing something horrible, and I don't want to do horrible things. I want to be better, but if I'm doing something shitty, I can very easily accept that I'm doing something shitty. And, it's easy for me to also call other people out for being pieces of shit. So, yeah, I think a lot of people lack that. I think they lack the ability to recognize that they are pieces of shit. And I don't think they're very much motivated to change because of that.
I want to ask you more about Gary, and because his speech is one of the most tremendous things that's ever been produced in animal rights, and
Yeah.
it's just a huge bummer to me that he's not doing activism. And I disagree with Gary about a lot of stuff. I disagree with you about a lot of stuff. I disagree with Gary about some of the statements he made about Palestinians and black people and so on. I also think the movement's response to it was terrible in driving him out of the movement.
Yeah.
But you brought something up. Let's talk about that. But you brought something up that I have to ask you about, which is like, why do you think you're a piece of shit? What do you? I mean, what do you mind sharing? I mean, I just don't know your background well enough to say like, what did you go through that led you to be more open to this?
I had a very hostile childhood. I had very like super crazy hockey parents, and they would basically just talk down to me whenever I played bad in a hockey game, and I developed like a weird inferiority complex and crap around that. It took a very long time to get over. So yeah, that's basically the gist of it.
Do you still play hockey today at all?
No. Yeah. I rollerblade, but I don't play hockey.
Yeah. No, I think there's a lot of people in veganism and animal rights who have been through similar experiences, including me. So your theory might be right, that there's something about just facing that sort of pressure and maybe even abuse that makes you more open to the idea that, there are other abuses happening, and maybe I'm even participating in some of them. Because I definitely felt like shit my entire childhood, different reasons. I was not a hockey player. I was just a Chinese kid whose parents, my parents are great and amazing, and I love them.
You didn't get all A+ on your tests?
Yep.
A-? Oh no.
No, my mom was a tiger mom, and she was an amazing human being, and I love her, and she's no longer with us, and I don't want to speak ill of the dead at all. And I wouldn't anyways, if she were alive, because she was just kind of taught to be that way. That was the way, like, good Chinese parents acted towards their kids, just always making them feel like they're a piece of crap, So like, you're right. I mean, not even A versus A-. I remember like I'd come home with like a 95% and have the highest grade in a math class, and my mom would be upset and yell at me for not getting 100%. That was really my mom was, which.
Yeah, I knew a lot of kids like that when I went to school. A lot of Indian parents and Chinese parents are like that.
Yeah. Did you grow up in Toronto?
Yeah.
Okay. And when did you watch Gary's speech? Like when was that moment for you?
This was like about 14 years ago. Yeah, but I had a friend at the time who shared the speech. He said, after watching this, I'm going to go vegan. 2 weeks later, the fucking jackass is eating meat. But yeah, I watched it right away. I was just convinced after watching it. Like, I just couldn't think of any argument against veganism. So I just went vegan right then and there.
What was it in the argument? Was it just everything, or was there a part of the video that it's for those of you who haven't seen the speech, go watch the speech because it's well worth watching. It's called, I think it's still on YouTube. It's just called The Greatest Speech.
It's like the best, great, yeah, something like that.
It really is pretty fantastic.
Yeah, and it was basically everything together. There was, no health argument I could make, no argument about like not being able to get enough protein. Environmental arguments, like the idea of like, oh well, it's the circle of life and nature, and he like debunked all that crap. And the ethical argument, like he showed footage of animal suffering that I hadn't seen before, and just there was especially one scene where this farmer was just beating the crap out of a little calf, and it's just that especially was really powerful to me because even if everything else weren't true, that there were health detriments, that it wasn't best for the environment, like I just can't get behind supporting an industry that would do that to an animal.
Yeah. I mean, there's something especially vile about doing it to a vulnerable being like a baby too. The fact that they do this so often all the animals that are killed in animal agriculture are babies, because even pigs, 250-pound pigs are actually half their adult size. They're 6 months old when they're slaughtered, and we brutalize them when they're still babies. Were you an animal person before this?
Yeah, I really liked animals.
Yeah. So was I. I think that's true of a lot of people too. Where did that come from
Yeah.
for you? Were you just someone who just like watched nature videos, or did you guys have dogs and cats growing up? You've got two cats now. Is that true?
Yeah, two.
Two cats.
Yeah, Prismo and Bimo. Yeah, and they're fed a vegan diet. We can
Don't
talk
get us into
about.
that controversy.
Yeah, we can talk about some of that later, maybe. But
I'm with you on that. I've had vegan cats my entire life too.
yeah,
But
yeah,
so
but
you had cats and dogs growing up?
yeah. Had a cat growing up. Got a dog a bit later. I think when I was in my teens. But yeah, I've always been an animal person. I've always felt like I could understand animals a little easier than people.
Hmm.
So yeah, I don't know. They're beautiful. They're interesting. Something pure about them. I always just butted heads with people, but I can just like sit at a park and just watch squirrels, play around, and I don't know. There was something that just brought peace when I just watch animals.
Yeah. Man, I wish more people understood that there's something incredibly beautiful about just living peacefully with other animals, that we are not at our best, and it's not good for us to hurt them. We're at
Yeah,
our best when we're kind to them, when we're caretakers to the other beings, including other human beings. But I think you're right. So many people are just blinded to that entire possibility because of our tribal nature. We just go along with what other people do. Have you ever talked to Gary? He would love you.
I sent him a message a while back when I first started my YouTube channel, and I told him that his video inspired me to become vegan and start the
Hmm.
whole YouTube thing. And he just messaged back like, "That's great, awesome," and he apparently watched some of my content.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah, haven't
you and
really talked to
he,
him though.
you and he have very similar personalities.
Yeah, yeah,
So I think he would really love you. He's actually not that far from me. He lives in Ann Arbor.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
He can't come to Canada because he's a terrorist, but
yeah, neither can I at this point.
yeah,
So, but if you ever visit the States, you should try and hit him up. I could
yeah.
put you in touch with him. I know the
Okay,
sanctuary that he volunteers at all the time, which actually went through its own controversy recently. I don't even want to go into it, but a huge amount of infighting around the sanctuary he volunteers at. I hope Gary's not in the midst of that, but yeah, Gary's a really good guy, and um, I hope we can find a way. I've been trying to get him back involved in animal rights in some way, but yeah, maybe
yeah.
we can work
Apparently,
together
he
on that.
just got super burnt out. Like I heard he would just argue with everybody nonstop at like
Mhm.
every chance he got, and it just kind of burnt him out.
What was the infighting for sure? It wasn't kind of the repression. It wasn't even the struggles of trying to convince non-vegans to be vegan. I think it was fellow vegans going after him that made him feel
Yeah.
like I'm done. Like he,
I've heard some ridiculous accusations against him that he was like some sort of rape apologist or something.
well, because so what happened was he said, I think in a speech, I think it was possibly in an interview in Israel, because he was huge in Israel.
Hmm.
He said something along the lines of, I hope every fur owner faces the same rape and anal electrocution that an animal feels. I hope every slaughterhouse worker who has to slice the animal in the animal's throat someday feels the pain and
Yeah.
terror of the animal whose throat is being slit. And it wasn't a direct threat. And it wasn't like he was saying, I'm going to go do this. But even just saying, I personally think that we shouldn't say those things. I understand why people say them, because it's a common human mentality that when you see someone inflicting violence, you want to inflict violence on them. And
Yeah.
there's even logical and moral justifications for it, deterrence, trying to prevent harm by causing harm against the one who's causing harm. And, I know
Well,
you
so
have a
many of
certain
these people
perspective on this.
just deserve it.
Yeah.
Like,
And just moral
yeah,
just deserts. You could just say, just in the same way that we punish people in prisons for various violent crimes. If somebody commits a rape or some violent act against a human being, those people are not saying, "Oh, how you can't punish someone for that. That's too much. Just give them some education." We usually, at least within the human species, say, even if there is no deterrence, even if it's not going to prevent any additional crime, we should punish this person because they hurt someone really, really badly.
yeah,
And I think Gary was just trying to be anti-speciesist, but yeah, a lot of people accused him of being a rape apologist after he made that remark. And then there was a comment about Black people that got him in a lot of trouble too, because he made this post about I think it was called like Blacks, Palestinians, and Other Racists. And he was basically comparing speciesism to racism and saying essentially that the Black Lives Matter movement, the Palestinian Liberation Movement, all these movements are racist because they're not including anti-speciesism within their philosophy. While they're all very supportive of each other and they love the idea of human liberation when it comes to animals, they're all ignorant. And there's a lot of merit to that position, but I think especially given that Gary's a white person himself, to accuse Black and Palestinian people of racism rubbed a lot of people, including a lot of other vegans, the wrong way.
Yeah. So, the things that I'm able to say with no like blowback, just because I'm like half Black, I've definitely seen that where white people aren't allowed to, point out obvious facts that Black people can be racist too.
I mean, you've gotten in some trouble too, though, Richard.
Yeah.
You've gotten away with some things, and then a lot of people really dislike you, which we've talked about in the past, which I think is a bummer because to me, the most, not the most important, but among the most important things a movement can do is just speak truth. And if we're telling people they can say things only if they're of a certain race or gender, and if they're not, even if it's truly what they believe, and even if it's a mistake, like if people aren't honest, we're done. People have to be able to be honest. And that's one of the things that's great about you and your channel. Like even when I disagree with you, I can count on you to be honest. And that's just saying a lot in today's world. So, and the same was true of Gary. The same was true of Gary. And it's been a loss of the movement. I think he was spending so much of his time fighting other vegans and I don't think that's what he wanted to spend his life doing. Like he wanted to help animals, that he eventually just gave up. And I've tried many times to try and get him involved. I reached out to him recently, again, before the trial and said, hey, you've got such a powerful voice. And I think he wants to help, but I think he just feels almost traumatized by his experience in the movement. And it sucks.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you think you've sustained yourself? Because, I mean, you've been in the fight so many times within the vegan movement, but you keep plugging along.
Yeah. I just don't care what other people think. I just kind of brush it off. I think the entire world could hate me, but it just wouldn't faze me.
Why?
I've just learned to tolerate it. I think it's part of it's just the way I got brought up. Some of it might just be genes. I'm just able to not take other people too seriously. Yeah.
I think that's really important, especially as an activist. We have to develop that kind of independence. And I mean, on some level, you have to care what people think because you can't change people if you're not trying to understand why they think what they think. But you can't make it sort of an existential concern for yourself and your own activism. Otherwise, you're going to give up very quickly because when you're an activist,
I don't think you really need to understand why people think the way they think outside of just being able to understand their argument so you can defeat it. There's a lot of ways to rationalize like why somebody might think a certain way, like the way they've been brought up or something like that. Who cares? The only thing that I really focus on is just being able to defeat their arguments.
How'd you develop that mentality?
I've just always had that mentality.
Even when you're like a hockey player growing up?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that one of the things that I've seen change in the animal rights over the last 10 years is 10 years ago, there were a lot more thoughtful conversations happening on various social media platforms and forums. I mean, back in the day, you're probably too young to even remember this, but there used to be some vegan forums like Vegan Freaks. Do you remember Vegan Freaks?
No.
Yes, this is boring. How old are you? 30?
33.
Yeah, so you're about 10 years younger than me. There used to be a forum called Vegan Freaks. There was a forum called Vegan Represent. And there were a lot of really...
43?
I'm 43. I'm 42.
Oh, wow. You look good. You look good for your
Thank
age.
you.
Yeah.
Well, veganism helps.
Yeah.
I also do some working out, which we could talk about. Not as much as you do, but some. But there used to be these spaces where people could have really thoughtful conversations. And I feel like argument and reasoning mattered a lot more. And in today's world, it's interesting because, I mean, you're big on YouTube. And I feel like in YouTube, I guess there is a space where reasoning and argument still matters. but so much of what passes for argument is just tribal identity. It's just someone
Yeah.
tweeting an insult, and that's the beginning and the end of it. No one actually cares and digs any deeper into it. And I don't know. It's one of the things I'm most pessimistic about, because I think if we actually have the arguments about animal rights, which even with smart people, I mean, you may disagree with this, but with smart people like Alex O'Connor or Sam Harris, you look at Sam Harris and his evolution, the more people have discussed animal rights with him, the more he's moved in the direction of being vegetarian or vegan himself. Is he vegetarian now? I think he is. I think he tried it and then gave it up and started again.
I don't know. The last thing I heard about him was like talking about this was like from a couple years ago. He was saying something to the effect of once they make tofu that's as healthy as steak, he can become vegan, something like that. I don't know if he is even vegetarian at this point.
Yeah, he might not be. I think that he was vegetarian for ethical reasons because he decided, what we do to animals is an atrocity. And then he gave it up for health reasons or convenience reasons, and then started again, I believe, recently. I could be wrong about that. I mean, what do you make of people like that, though, like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris? Because Dawkins especially is someone who's compared animal agriculture to slavery and then still eats animals himself.
Well, he's flat out admitted he's a hypocrite. Sam refuses to admit he's a hypocrite. And again, this is a guy who claims to be a moral philosopher trying to justify a Holocaust. I don't think the guy's particularly bright. If you've seen his debate on moral objectivism with countless people, my God, that guy is like practically brain dead, at least when it comes to arguing that topic. Like, I don't know how many times the is-ought gap has been explained to this guy, but he just still doesn't get it.
So why don't you explain the is-ought gap since you brought it up?
Yeah, so it's a form of informal logical fallacy. It's basically a non sequitur. You cannot come to a... You can't make purely empirical premises and come to an ethical conclusion. So you can't say something like, there is suffering... let me think of... I can't think of an example right now, but you can't make purely empirical premises like I don't know, people feel pain, pain feels bad, therefore suffering is bad. Why is suffering bad? You didn't make you didn't include that sort of ethical phrasing in your set of premises. So if you're just making purely empirical statements, you can't come to that sort of ethical conclusion. Sam doesn't seem to understand this. And he also doesn't seem to understand what objective means, because he keeps arguing that morality is objective. Objective means exists without a mind. I don't know how morality could exist without the presence of a mind.
I might push back on that, but yeah, I mean, the is-ought gap, I agree with you completely, that it's one of the most kind of fundamental distinctions in moral philosophy, right? That it's surprising to me. I haven't watched too much of Sam Harris's stuff, but it's surprising me. Can't catch that. But it's just the basic idea that, say lions are tearing animals to pieces. That is the case. That doesn't mean it ought to be the case. Just because it's happening doesn't mean it should be that way. Doesn't mean you shouldn't change things. And I mean, you made the same point earlier to me about kind of rationalization and hypocrisy. Even if human beings are this way, doesn't mean we ought to be that way. It might be that we're all just fucked up and we ought to change, right? And we got to figure out how to build systems when that's not true. I'll say this on moral objectivism. I think I'm with Sam, although I don't know exactly what his position is. I think moral principles can be true independent of any mind, in the same way that math can be true independent of any mind. And I haven't really developed this theory that carefully, and I'm not a moral philosopher, but my general sense is that, and I have written about this, anytime you have a social organization where you're trying to coordinate and instill cooperation in a large number of sentient beings, if you have cooperative norms, if you apply things like the golden rule, that system will survive and thrive in a way that conflictual norms will not allow and facilitate that organization or society or even species to survive. And so over time, what you see is a convergence towards better moral norms of cooperation and kindness and compassion. And this is why, for example, over
Well,
years,
they're
we've
not
seen,
necessarily better in the sense you're talking about. They're just more successful.
yeah. So that's an is-ought gap, right? That's just because this is the case doesn't mean it ought to be the case, right? You're
Yeah.
making an empirical claim and then converting it into a moral claim. I think that my answer to that is that may be the case, but we are still conscious social beings. And if everywhere in the universe, maybe all conscious and social beings move towards something like the golden rule, and I think there's something to be said about that. I think, like Peter Singer's written about the expanding circle over time, and I think he's right about that. And one of my former mentors when I was in, of all things, econ grad school, this guy, Joan, he wrote this book called Why Nations Fail, which is a great book. And it's all about how over time, civilizations and political kind of organizations of various sorts, whether they're parties or nations or even international organizations that have more inclusive norms. If you like target and exclude people and bully people outside of your group, you do less well. Your nation doesn't survive. And I think there's an evolution towards social norms of cooperation and kindness, because it's very hard when we're tearing each other to pieces for any of us to survive, much less the social organization as a whole. So I think over time, we will get to that point. So I take it from this, you're not a moral realist. You don't think there are true moral propositions, or do you think there are?
No,
Just
I'm a moral anti-realist. I haven't heard a good argument for the case. I don't know how it could even be possible that moral claims are objectively true. Again, how could morality exist without the presence of a mind? These are just social preferences that we have. And since they're just social preferences, they just need to have a mind to exist.
if these are social preferences, they're ironclad rules of social organization, say even everywhere in the universe, does that become a rule
Well, it
of some
doesn't make it
sort?
objective. It doesn't make it objective. It just makes it universal.
Okay, it's fair. So what motivates you to fight so hard and advocate for animals if you're a moral anti-realist? Isn't your
Because
preference
that's my
for,
preference.
huh.
Yeah,
So you
that
see
I
yourself
just
as
have a
just,
set of preferences.
and you're just part of the same power struggle that everyone else is
Yeah.
involved in? And yeah, that's like refreshingly honest. And I have a couple friends who feel the same way. To me, it's almost alien, because I feel like if I thought that my moral views were just a preference that I was trying to impose on the world around me, it'd be hard to motivate myself every day, because it would feel almost dictatorial. I mean, do you feel that way at all? Do you feel like, well, why should I fight so hard if this is just my preference?
No, I feel like my preferences are better than other people's.
But in what
Like
sense are they
strawberry
better?
ice cream.
If there's no objectivity to the moral proposition, what makes it better?
It's like pineapple on pizza, dude. It's just wrong.
It's just wrong. As someone who likes pineapple on pizza, I'll have to disagree with you. Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I think part of the problem for me is, and part of the reason I think none of us can really have a good understanding of moral realism versus anti-realism, is we don't understand consciousness, much less social organization. We really don't.
Yeah.
We have, and there are so many people so much smarter than me who've set out the problem, but it's just so, and even with all the artificial intelligence that's been created, it's so mind-bogglingly complex that beings can have subjective experience. Even the fact that we're aware of things, like, and that we can see and interpret that those photons hitting the receptor cells in our eyes into this weird pastiche of colors and images that go into our brain. It's so mind-blowingly complex. And I think whatever you think about moral realism, consciousness is a huge part of morality, and it's hard to imagine consciousness.
Well, it's dependent on consciousness.
Maybe, but given that we don't even understand what consciousness is, I don't know. I mean, have you heard of what's it called? Panpsychism?
No.
Okay, so I think there are like serious thinkers who believe in this. There are serious thinkers who think that consciousness is like an attribute of all matter, similar to gravity or electromagnetic force. And so, and the reason we have such this kind of conceptual and intellectual problem of understanding consciousness is just we haven't discovered it in the same way that before Newton discovered gravity, we just had no concept of how to even grapple with the fact that, the Earth is spinning around the sun, the moon is spinning around the Earth. And panpsychism is a theory that we think about, like the mind-body gap. How is it that this inanimate object could create this thing called consciousness? The reason is because we just haven't discovered this attribute of bodies in all physical objects, like even just an atom, that is called consciousness. And someday when we discover it, then suddenly it'll be clear why consciousness exists. And in the same way that once we understood gravity, then so much of the universe became a lot more explicable than it was beforehand. And I don't agree with panpsychism, but it's fun to think about as one of the possible explanations for the mind-body gap. But the best example that I've heard of the consciousness problem, have you heard of like the Mary problem in consciousness research? I think it's called the Mary problem. So I'll say it very shortly because I'm going to butcher it to some extent because I'm not a neuroscientist or a philosopher of mind. But the problem is basically this. Say someone is colorblind their entire life, but they become the world's greatest neuroscientist, and not just the world's greatest neuroscientist, but the greatest neuroscientist in history. And they understand every aspect of vision. And in fact, they become so proficient in vision that they actually cure colorblindness. And so they develop this technical cure or surgery, and they go under the knife, they wake up, and I think the name of the individual, I think Frank Jackson is the cognitive scientist who came up with the Mary problem. I think he gave this neuroscientist the name Mary. And when Mary wakes up for the first time in her life, she sees the color red, right? And the question is, has she learned something new? Because she's the world's greatest neuroscientist. She knew every single technical, scientific, back down to the subatomic particle to the point that she could cure color blindness. But now she's actually seen the color red for the first time in her life. Has she learned something new? And I think if you think consciousness is just a computational problem, then you might say no. And there are some neuroscientists like Daniel Dennett, I think, says no, she hasn't actually learned anything new. She just, there's this weird subjective experience. It's just her computer of her brain, like her particular brain, like processed something she already knew, but she didn't actually learn anything new. But other people, including me, would say, no, there is something new you learned from actually just experiencing red. She saw the color red and she knew for the first time, she learned for the first time what red actually looks like. And that's something she learned. And that's something you can only learn through consciousness.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, but it's an interesting problem. But if you agree with that, then the question is like, what did she learn? And how did what does that mean? And that's like a complex question, at least for me. I don't have an answer to what that actually means for what consciousness is, but it's confusing.
Yeah, I would just define consciousness as the ability to have a subjective experience. So, if you've...
But what does that mean?
What do you mean? Just a mind-dependent experience.
But then what does that mean? I mean, how is that different from a computer just processing a bunch of data,
Well, it doesn't have a mind.
But again, what does that mean? You can keep going. Like, what does that mean? How is that different from a computer?
I don't know if you can reduce that anymore. Like, I don't know if you could reduce the definition down anymore. Just a mind is something that's able to consciously perceive things. Yeah.
Do you think where do you I don't actually know the answer to this question. Where do you draw the line in consciousness? Do you think insects have consciousness?
For moral value?
For any value, or for even just definitionally, like what is a conscious being? Is an invertebrate, is an insect, like an ant?
Well, they could be. Things like ants or bees, they're probably sentient.
Yeah.
The amount of conscious experiences they're able to have is probably lower than a human being. But where I would grant a creature moral value it is when they have the ability to have a conscious experience that promotes or generates well-being. So if you're like there could be species out there that can only perceive like colors or light or something. So if they can only perceive like light and dark and that's it, that's the extent of their conscious experience. I wouldn't really value that. But if they can feel like pleasure and pain, that's something that I would place value on.
So does that mean you think eating mouse is vegan?
Yeah,
You do.
probably. So, yeah, bivalves, they're probably not sentient,
Sentient.
and even
Yeah.
if they are, they can probably only like experience things like I don't know, surface touch or something like that. They
Mhm.
probably can't feel pain.
Do you eat them yourself? No
No,
judgment. No. Okay.
yeah,
Why not?
no, it's just gross.
It's gross. But you
Yeah,
would. You wouldn't have an ethical problem with it.
yeah, no.
Okay. What do you think of the argument that, we should err on the side of caution, and given they're part of technically the animal family, we should not be eating them, just to show we're not hypocrites to people who are going to condemn us for being hypocrites?
Yeah, it's really hard to justify it with the cautiousness argument, just because they're extremely simple creatures.
Yeah.
They just have nerve ganglia. They don't have a central nerve system, and they can appear to do like some relatively complex tasks, like run away from predators or
Mhm.
something. But there have been experiments on individual neurons. Individual neurons can conduct extremely complex processes, so it doesn't really say much. So yeah, like it just seems cautiousness to an extreme degree.
Dream. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. With bivalves, my understanding of their evolution is for probably at least hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of years, they've essentially evolved in an evolutionary setting not different from a plant, because they lack the ability to move. And so even if some evolutionary ancestor 10 million years ago might have had a more developed nervous system, it's possible. One of their ancestors, I think, did. That evolution, because they don't have to make decisions, there's no need for them to have well-being, because they're just sitting there kind of filtering water to absorb food. They don't
yeah,
have any particular decisions to make. And it seems like the mind is an evolutionary adaptation to complex decisions. And
yeah.
they're not just not making complex decisions, not really making any decisions at all, as far as we can tell. And yeah, and that's not true of a pig, a cow, a chicken, or a human. So yeah, it's interesting though. Um, so speaking of kind of ethics in animals, I do want to ask you about this controversial position you have about predators.
Yeah,
So
sure.
you're probably the only vegan I've talked to who thinks violence against carnivores is acceptable. Can you explain that?
Yeah. So basically, if you've ever seen like a horror movie where there's a monster chasing a group of people, so like the Alien movies, if you've ever seen the movie Alien or Aliens, there's this alien called a xenomorph that's going after people, killing and eating them. And they also use human beings for sustenance. They also need to use human beings to actually breed. So they'll like implant an alien egg inside you, then the alien will burst out of your chest, and that's how they procreate. So we would have no problem eradicating those aliens to defend the human species. We would eliminate them to extinction, ideally, so that they don't kill any people. If we're fine with killing xenomorphs or vampires or goblins, like from Lord of the Rings, why do we have a problem with killing lions so that they don't eat, a gazelle? Because again, the lion to a gazelle is like a
It's a
xenomorph to
xenomorph. Yeah.
us. So, yeah, that seems like a point of hypocrisy to me. Where if we're fine with killing, certain creatures to protect ourselves, why wouldn't we? If we're going to include animals in in our human rights doctrine, then why wouldn't we protect animals from other animals? And again, if we're going to grant animals human rights, that would mean animals need protection from humans and other animals.
Animals. Yeah.
So yeah, so we should be in favor of protecting prey species from carnivorous species.
Yeah. It does seem like a pretty straightforward application of anti-speciesism. Do you know if Peter Singer has written at all about this? Because he's taken on a lot of controversial subjects, and I usually think he'll go where anti-speciesism tells him to go too.
I don't
I
think
wonder.
I'm familiar with his take on this.
Hmm. My take on this is I think you're right that the logical implication of anti-speciesism is to say that predator species are engaged in horrible violence that needs to be stopped. But where I'm not with you is in the orc case or in the xenomorph case, I think we shouldn't be killing them either. I
Well,
think
why
that,
not?
uh, so I think for two reasons. One is I think, as you probably know about me, I believe in strategic and philosophical nonviolence. And I believe in this philosophically, not just as a matter of personal preference, because I think it's objectively correct. So, which I'm sure you're not happy with that position, but that's my position. I think that both strategically and philosophically, we should be nonviolent wherever we can. And by what I mean by strategic is I think one of the fundamental problems with our species and with violence, probably across the universe, even to the extent there are other alien species that are struggling with the same moral questions we're engaged in, is the arrogance that we have when we decide to take the freedom, the joy, and the lives of other beings. That action has to be taken with extraordinary humility, if at all. And so erring as much as we can, just as a rule, on the side of not interfering with other living beings in that way is extremely important. And that's basically nonviolence, that we're too
Okay,
likely to
but
make mistakes.
if you're in favor of nonviolence, and by killing a predatory animal, you would reduce the amount of violence that is occurring, wouldn't that fulfill your goal?
Yeah, so I think that's right if you're just strategically nonviolent. And I think the point is I don't think we can ever be confident that that is what we're doing. Partly because when you start engaging in violence and ignoring the suffering or the life of one being on some sort of ends justify the means basis, it's hard to create a limiting principle. You start doing that in all
Well,
contexts.
it's not an ends justify the means principle. Again, if you have a nonviolence principle and there's a species that is going to commit violence, guaranteed, that's just their instinctual, that's their instinctual behavior. Like even like baby kittens, they'll play around with like dead animals that their like mothers bring them and stuff.
Yeah.
Um, so if that's their instinctual behavior and they're going to commit violence and that's what they need to do to get food, then and your goal is to reduce violence, then would that not fulfill your goal, killing the predatory species?
So I think there are two problems. One is the confidence problem. How confident are you that you're right? That this species, that this is the best and only way, that this species actually will commit violent acts against other animals? And second, that my killing this animal will actually reduce rather than increase the amount of suffering and violence in the world, right? I think we should be very, very cautious about inflicting violent acts against anyone. Because if you look at the history of the human species and our arrogance and our willingness to go out there and slaughter all sorts of other humans and animals on the basis of the idea that we're creating a more peaceful world, history is replete with
Well,
examples of people going wrong. But the second thing is it changes us. Even if we are actually 100% sure that by killing these xenomorphs, by killing these orcs and goblins, I will reduce the amount of violence in the world. I think what human history shows is that when you create the institutions, the culture, the structures, the processes of violence, it's hard to limit that to those scenarios because of the fact that we are a violent, power-hungry species. That once you start creating these implements and systems of violence, even just weapons, the existence of weapons is a dangerous thing in the hands of a species that has not used those weapons in kind ways for the last 100,000 years, since we started becoming tool using apes. And so if look, we're a very dangerous species. We've used weapons and tools in very negative ways. We've used culture and religion and institutions in very dangerous ways. We should probably just have a rule of thumb that says we don't commit violent acts because we don't trust ourselves not to, even if we think in this case, it absolutely is justified. We're just not convinced once we create literally even the tool, like a nuclear bomb or a knife or a gun, that is only going to be used in those scenarios. It's inevitably going to be used in scenarios where that's absolutely not the case. What do you think of that?
yeah, I disagree. So you've seen the Alien movies, right?
I haven't.
Okay. You get.
I
You,
know the
you
shtick
should.
though. I know about the movie.
You should especially watch
Oh
Aliens,
no,
the
I saw
sequel.
Prometheus though. I saw
Okay.
Prometheus, which I thought was really good. Prometheus was a good movie.
So let's say you're on a planet and xenomorphs only exist on this planet. The only way they have to breed is to inject you with an alien parasite, and then there's going to be a chest burster that comes out of your chest, kills you, and these aliens also hunt and kill you. You're telling me if you're with a population of people trying to inhabit this planet, you'd let some of these creatures live?
I think the first question is an alternative to killing them?
Well, let's say there's none.
Okay. And
like we can't
I think very often we resort to killing before actually exploring that question fully. But ultimately, I'm a consequentialist. I think that what matters is outcomes. It's not just, are we kind and in some abstract
I think most people
way.
Yeah, so I think most people say they're consequentialists or utilitarians. They're not actually. Or they have to bite the bullet on really crazy. Yeah. Every time I have a debate on this, I just ask, okay, if there's a woman who's in a coma and there's a rapist and the rape victim's never going to find out about it, is it okay to rape that woman? Because you're actually creating a net positive utility where the rapist is feeling pleasure. So most people would say no, it's still wrong to rape the person, even though it's creating net utility. So I don't think most people are actually consequentialists or utilitarians. There's
I agree with that.
A principle of rights that we care about.
What's your answer to that question?
Well, it's wrong. It would be wrong to rape a person in a coma. I'm more concerned with rights.
Yeah. So you're consider yourself a deontologist, that you think there's just right and wrong answers. But that's based on just a moral preference you have. It's not based on any sort of objective reality. Yeah, so this is not very well developed, but I think morality, sort of like the physical laws of the universe, changes depending on the perspective you take, right? So, and in physics, if you look at small things like the various particles of the universe, the right approach to the problem is what physicists call the standard model, right? That there's, quantum mechanics, and there's things that happen at a very small scale that don't make sense when you look at the cosmic scale, the universal scale, right? Then you have to think about things like general and special relativity, because big things operate differently than small things. And physics is modular in that way. There are like certain approaches to physics that make sense in a specific case, like a subatomic particle, and other concepts and approaches to physics that make sense when you're looking at stars and universes and galaxies. And I think the same is true of morality in this way that I haven't really developed very well, but I do think is objective. I think when you look at an individual case, like a woman in a coma, the principle of utilitarianism just isn't the right framework to think about the problem. Not just because, there's like the excuse of rule utilitarianism, which you've assumed away that problem, right? And the rule utilitarian approach to the rape of a coma victim is to say, well, no, we're trying to set a rule, and there's going to be some actual harm to an actual conscious living human if we allow even a woman in a coma to be raped. You're assuming that's not true. You're saying, no, don't fight the hypothetical. I think even in cases like that, even if you're not a rule utilitarian, there's something about looking at the individual case that shifts us more towards your style of thinking, a deontology, while when we're looking at big numbers, the same weird moral conundrums exist for you as someone who's a rights-based thinker when we look at like billions of people, right? Because if I asked you, well, look, if we know, for example, that having a system of transit that includes automobiles will kill around 40,000 Americans every year, which is true. 40,000 people will die. We know they will die, and none of those people signed up for it. They didn't consent to be the person who will die. In fact, some of them could be little kids who they never even had a chance to even drive. Like, they're not part of the system at all. And that kid's going to die because you decided to allow these cars to go. But on some level, you have to make a utilitarian calculation and say, well, at the scale of 300 million Americans, we're just going to let people drive. Like, it's worth the consequences. Like, some people are going to die. In some sense, that child's right will be violated because she will die and she'll never get a chance to drive, and she hasn't agreed or consented to this. We're going to allow it to happen because we think driving is worth it. So I just think, I guess my point is, when you look at big picture problems and policy, usually utilitarian calculus is what matters. Well, when you look at individual cases, usually some sort of rights-based thinking is what matters. Now, it doesn't really make any sense because it's how do you merge the two? So
well, you can be a threshold deontologist.
Say more.
You can hold a deontological position, but at certain thresholds, you would consider the total utility.
Yeah, it's true. So if there's enough people kind of affected by some sort of rights violation.
If there were, if car ownership caused the death of the species, you'd probably say, okay, maybe you shouldn't have a right to drive a car.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. All right.
But
no, go ahead.
We were talking about the xenomorph problem.
Yeah.
Like again, if there was some sort of alien species on a planet you were trying to inhabit that would kill and eat you and impregnate you in the most like messed up way, where there's a parasite in you that's going to grow and then burst out of your chest and you're going to die a horrible death, you wouldn't try to eradicate that species?
No.
Really? So you would just let people die?
I mean, I think you're actually, this is not really hypothetical. This is real life for the other non-human animals on this earth, that we are the xenomorphs of the planet Earth, right? We go around wiping out the other species. We don't literally implant our children in them, but certainly our children and the continued growth and birth of our children has been on the backs of animals for hundreds of thousands of years, or at least tens of thousands of years, since the cognitive revolution 100,000 years ago. And if some artificial intelligence or even some species of non-human animal developed the power to wipe all the human beings out, I'd say, no, you shouldn't do that. I mean,
I would be in favor of killing carnists. So selectively taking out people who eat meat. Again, I don't know how you can say that you're against violence, but then allow a violent species to exist where they're guaranteed to murder other species.
I think part of it is if you think that being against something, it's interesting. We're kind of inverting positions now, because I'm taking the deontological position and you're taking the utilitarian position, right? If you think being against something means
it's not a utilitarian position. I'm in favor of protecting the rights of the individual.
But you're saying that the way to show your adherence to that position is by minimizing the number of rights violations, right?
Yeah.
And that's a very utilitarian calculation. That's like you're counting the number of rights violations, you're trying to get the number down. And what I'm saying, I'm now taking the deontological position. I'm saying when I'm against or for something, the question isn't whether I'm minimizing or maximizing the number of outcomes, the consequences. It's just, what should I do? What sort of act should I engage in right now? And how do I act in a way that's consistent with my principles? And what Kant believed, and there's some merit to the position. This is why I think, in individual cases, that the way we determine whether we're supporting or not supporting violence against another being a rights violation is just asking not the question of what are the net consequences of my action, but just, if I were in the xenomorph's position, what would I want? And am I violating this xenomorph's rights? And clearly the xenomorph doesn't want to die. The xenomorph doesn't want to be shot and killed or burned or whatever they're doing to kill the xenomorphs. And therefore it's wrong for me to try and take their life. I don't know how deep I believe in that position. I think the strategic argument that I'm making is a lot better than the philosophical argument, namely that I think that it's incredibly dangerous for us to get in the business of taking animals' lives of any sort because of our history as a species. And so for that reason, I think I'm a lot stronger grounds in saying, if we came to another planet and, I could give human beings weapons to wipe out all the carnivores or even another species weapons, I just think creating those structures is extremely dangerous. And our best hope for creating a peaceful world is for everyone to get out of the business of violence.
Okay, but you can't do that because there's species that are going to continually, perpetually support violence.
Maybe not. Maybe.
Wait. Let me think of it a different hypothetical for you. So, let's say Nazis were a different species. So the Nazis weren't just like white people living in Germany. Let's say the Nazis were actually I don't know, a type of goblin.
Mhm.
Would you not be in favor of wiping out all goblins if they're biologically wired to hunt down and kill Jews?
No, I wouldn't.
You would let the Nazis just hunt down and kill Jews?
I don't think those are the only alternatives. I think you have to find other
Well,
alternatives.
it
I
is.
think,
Well, it is.
yeah. So, yeah,
You
in
can't
some ways, I'm not
capture
being fair to your
so
hypothetical, because your
so
hypothetical is there are no other alternatives, right? So I have to kind of accept the hypothetical
well,
the way it's
in
stated.
World War
Yeah.
II, there was no other alternative but to go to war with the Nazis. Like, would you say World War II was unjustified because
I'm
we
not
had to kill
unsympathetic to
Nazis?
Gandhi's position. I think that if there were a truly nonviolent movement of resistance fighting the Nazis, I think it might have been more effective than what actually
No,
happened.
no.
So you're familiar with
If
the.
you no
So
no
let
no.
me just ask
So
you this, Richard.
this
Do you know Erica Chenoweth's research on nonviolent versus violent resistance?
no, but
Okay. So
look,
there's a
when you
political
have
scientist named Erica Chenoweth who's looked at revolutions and resistance to repressive regimes like the Nazi regime in Germany, and looked at hundreds of data points through history. Like, she's looked at basically every data point she could possibly find. And what she found is that nonviolent resistance is about twice as effective as violent resistance. And this is nothing to do with philosophically whether you think
well,
violence
guess
is valid.
what? The people who didn't shoot back against the Germans, they failed. All the Jews who chose to stay in Germany, who didn't fight back, guess what? They were not effective at stopping Nazism. So all the Jews who just walked on
Yeah,
the fucking train cars, they're dead. So nonviolent resistance didn't do
didn't work
shit
for
in
them.
that case.
Yeah.
So no, this bullcrap about nonviolent resistance being more effective, that's just pure nonsense. If you have a position of never committing violence, and like Gandhi, that is the most pro-violence position you could possibly ever take.
Yeah.
Because guess what? You might not choose violence; other people will.
Mhm.
Hitler was dedicated to eradicating the earth of Jews. So
Yeah.
if you're not gonna kill Nazis, well, then you're just going to ensure the deaths of millions of innocent people. Same with carnivorous animals; they're dedicated to killing other animals. If you take a nonviolence position, well, they're dead.
Mhm.
Like the nonviolent action is the most violence promoting action you could possibly take.
I think that's a factual question ultimately, right? It's an empirical question as to which approach is actually going to reduce the most violence. And I do think ultimately, like I said, that strategic question is more important than any philosophical commitment you personally have to getting your hands dirty or not dirty. And I think that strategic and empirical and just kind of an evidentiary question has not fully been answered, but the evidence we have suggests that nonviolent resistance is more effective. Let me ask you.
Ask
Can I ask you?
well, you can't even ask them because they're all dead. Ask the Jews who just walked onto the train cars.
But there are many other instances, including Mao Zedong, where people used violent resistance and created more violence in the world. Right? Mao's perspective, the KMT before the Communist Party came along, was absolutely a
Look,
dictatorial, violent regime.
100 million people died under Mao Zedong. So more
Agreed. And
violence occurred because people were fighting Mao Zedong. He
no,
killed 100 million people.
I'm saying Mao chose to use violence. There was a way to encourage the KMT and the nationalists who controlled China in 1930 to change their practices so they weren't brutalizing peasants and the working class. It didn't
There was
use violent revolution. And I think
no,
part of the problem was that
Mao Zedong
Mao
just died of
decided,
old age. Mao Zedong just died of old age. That's what got rid of him.
but
There was no form of peaceful resistance did anything. Even people who protested against him peacefully, they died.
no,
So
I mean
like
peaceful
he ended up
resistance
killing
of the
100 million
nationalists, not of
people.
the communists. I'm talking about the era before. I'm saying the choice Mao made was to use violence. Or even like you look at, I don't know if you've studied Russian history at all. There was kind of a subset of the socialist movement under Lenin who believed in violent revolution. It was like, this is not entirely accurate, but I think from what I recall of history, and I'm definitely not a Russian history expert, although I did actually write a thesis about this a long time ago. There were like the Bolsheviks who were all about creating a revolutionary violent vanguard to drive forward progress. And there were the Mensheviks who, some of them were somewhat more supportive of violence, but generally much more moderate in terms of their means, not in terms of their vision of how we're going to get there, to a world where we treat working class people with decency. And Lenin used violence, and that created more violence in the world. That led to a lot more slaughter and death. And the Mensheviks, if if the socialists had taken the Menshevik approach, not that they were completely nonviolent, but they were certainly less violent than Lenin, I think the Soviet Union and the USSR and Russia would have been a better place in the long term. And you're right that there are specific examples. Like Erica Chenoweth's research doesn't prove that every time nonviolent resistance is going to be better than violent resistance. World War II might have been an example where violent resistance was the better outcome. But before you actually decide what sort of resistance you want to use, you don't know the answer to the question. And statistically and probabilistically, the odds are better if you non-violently revolt, you're going to reduce the amount of violence you've created in the world, or if you violently revolt and fight back, it's not that different. Even not that interpersonal relations can reflect kind of big systemic concerns, but it's not that different than like a personal fist fight. Like if someone punches you in the face, the odds that punching back are going to be the right approach to actually reducing the amount of violence in the world are usually pretty low. There are probably some instances where it's better to fight back. But my experience has been when someone punches you in the face, if you're actually trying to reduce the amount of suffering and violence in the world, the better way to approach it is to say, you know what, I got punched. That's fine. I don't have to fight back. I'm going to be the bigger person.
If you look at statistics when it comes to self-defense with a firearm, the vast majority, around 80%, not a single shot is fired. So if you brandish a firearm, that tends to de-escalate things pretty rapidly. So here's the thing, this philosophy of being nonviolent, no matter the situation, even if Nazis are killing you, this only works if the people you're fighting against are nonviolent. Everybody has to agree to a principle of nonviolence, which is impossible. So the only way to fight back against at least certain forms of extreme violence like Nazism is with violence. The people who are evil and enacting force on other people, they need to be stopped with violence. And the same with carnivorous animals. Like the only way to stop carnivorous animals from killing other animals is to use violence. So again, if you have a species that is going to murder, let's say they have to murder on average, I don't know, like say 30, 40 animals of other species per year to survive, and your interest is to reduce the amount of violence that's occurring, you can do that by killing these animals.
So with respect to your cats, if it's okay to go personal, if you became convinced that cats could not be vegan, I know your cats are vegan, so different story. But if the scientific evidence showed, and I don't think it will show this because I've raised vegan cats too, so I'm with you on this. If the scientific evidence ultimately showed that cats could not be vegan, do you think it would be our responsibility to eradicate cats from the face of the universe? Really?
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, I'll give you credit for taking your philosophical positions to the logical conclusion. Because I would not say that we should eradicate cats if they can't be vegan.
Well, look, let's say if let's say
actually, can I ask you one other follow-up question? I assume you think that wild cats should be exterminated then.
Yeah.
Because they can't be, I mean, they're not going to be vegan in the wild at all.
Yeah.
So you think it's justified to just shoot a cat in nature?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Like again, if we have companion animals and we had to kill to feed our companion animals, how in the hell could you justify keeping them alive if you believe in animal rights?
So do you think, like, so for example, did you hear about this controversy in Australia where they're killing cats? They're like shooting cats to, I don't even remember when it was.
I think they're doing that with wild dogs too.
Yeah. Are you generally supportive of that? Just no judgment. I don't.
Yeah.
Really?
If they're killing, like, I know cats especially, they're
they kill a lot of animals.
Devastating. Yeah.
No, they do. They kill. I don't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's like billions of birds.
Yeah.
Every year, maybe just in the United States. Just, they're probably like 100 million cats in the United States are probably killing. I guess if they each kill 10 birds, that's a billion birds a year.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll give you credit. You're definitely willing to take your philosophical position to its logical conclusion. I'm definitely not with you on cats. And where I think we do agree is I think
you're in favor
your
of animal
position.
rights,
I think
how could you justify feeding meat to an animal?
it's a good question. So I'm going to make a terrible confession to you, Richard. I did feed my cat Joan animal products in his last few months of life because he needed a medicated diet, and it just wasn't available in vegan form. So in his last few months of life, I got this weird prescription diet, and I didn't feel great about it. Um,
Yeah, you
I
shouldn't have
think,
fed your cat that.
yeah, I'm open to an argument that that was wrong, and I should have just allowed him to die, um, or
Well,
even
yeah,
just
he was
risked it.
going. Well, look, the cat's going to die anyway. We all die.
Yeah,
And if you're going to contribute to more animal deaths,
yes, yeah.
what's the point?
Yeah, I mean, so I can imagine a system in the long term. Maybe this is just rationalization. Maybe I'm being cosmic skeptic right now and just rationalizing my own hypocrisy. I can imagine a system where we feed cats, dogs, and other carnivores. I guess dogs technically are not carnivores, they're omnivores, but cats are probably obligate carnivores without human intervention.
Yeah.
Just roadkill, lab grown meat, those sorts of things. And so to me, when I purchased kind of the flesh. It wasn't just animal products. I mean, this is just straight up flesh, and it's really weird. This is just a weird kind of emotional and cognitive quirk. But for some reason, for me, it felt easier, and I felt less terrible buying fish than when I bought my cat like mammalian animals. Isn't that weird and kind of fucked up?
I mean, fish are probably less sentient, probably, but
Yeah, I don't
I
have
don't
high
think the
confidence that I would if I believed that, then I'd have a more reasonable justification for choosing the fish. I think it was just tribalism. It was just, like human beings, like those who are more similar to us. And for me, it just felt less bad to buy kind of the fish-based diet.
yeah.
And maybe people, I don't know, including you, maybe
Well,
people will hate me for this and say I'm a scumbag.
fish can't scream and everything, so
Yeah. So we don't empathize as much with them. But the way I partly rationalize this was by saying, I'd like to see a world where we could, because I don't know, maybe it will be the case that there's certain species that we can't create a vegan diet for them, and we need to find a way to feed them. And intrinsically, the problem is not with feeding flesh per se. The problem is with the violence that leads to the flesh being created. And so,
well, we
deontologically,
don't
just
have
in the
lab
moment,
grown meat now.
we don't have lab grown meat, but we may eventually. And at that
Yeah,
point,
but we
then
don't now. So how
intrinsically,
can you justify killing an animal to feed to another animal?
I think it's partly because I don't believe, and this is controversial too. I don't believe the act of consumption is killing an animal, and I don't believe even through supply and demand that the effects of consuming animal products are as linear and directly linked to the suffering and violence against an animal that most people, I think, in the vegan movement believe. This is also one of the reasons why I'm just not as much of a believer in consumer activism more generally. I think we should be vegan. I've been vegan for 24 years. I think it's a moral requirement for everyone who's trying to act ethically.
So
But I do see a difference between directly taking the life of an animal and just buying the product of an animal's death.
So if you buy, say, a chicken wing,
Mhm.
you're probably paying for like, I don't know, 1/10 of a chicken to be killed. So you'd have to buy like 10 chicken wings to equate to an actual life. So yeah, it's not linear. Like, buying one steak doesn't kill one cow.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not linear like that. But I think the statistic is, for your average dieter, if you go vegan, you'll save somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 animals per year.
Yeah.
So if you're like feeding your cat meat, would you be okay with killing a human being to feed your cat?
I'm not okay with killing anybody, human or non-human. What I'm saying is,
Then
I
why
think
did you feed your cat meat?
because I think there's a distinction between the act of consumption and the act of killing.
So if there was a
And
human meat trade, you would have been fine with paying for human flesh to feed your cat.
in principle, yes. Whether I actually would have been able to tolerate it is a different question. And that relates to the same weird moral and emotional biases
I
that I
don't
have
know
with
how
respect
you
to,
could say that while claiming to be vegan.
well, I mean, maybe I'm not vegan then.
Yeah,
Because I fed my
like
cat And this is a debate about vegan cats that I think has been raging in the vegan community, where a lot of people say, like, it's not okay. In the same way that I think most people would probably
Like
say,
you're claiming to support nonviolence, but then you supported violence by feeding your cat meat. Like, do you not see the hypocrisy?
I do see it. I think there's a credible argument that's true. I also think that
Like, wait,
deontologically,
it's one thing to say, I'm a moral hypocrite and I really, really loved my cat, and
yeah.
I just couldn't see. Like, it's one thing to say that, but then to cope and say, oh, well, like, it's not a 1-to-1 ratio. If you kill an animal, it's not killing, like, if you pay meat, like buy meat, like a fish fillet, it's not killing one animal. It's like 1/10 of an I I just want to, if you're going to say, like, okay, I was being a hypocrite and it was morally wrong for me to do that, like, whatever.
I'm not even saying that. I might be just a moral hypocrite. That's why I'm saying it could just be moral hypocrisy. And when I say bias or emotional influence,
well, it
that's
is.
what I'm saying. It
Well,
might be.
look,
Right.
it absolutely is hypocrisy,
Yeah.
because if you're going to say you're in favor of animal rights and you're, supporting nonviolence, but then you support an industry of violence to feed your cat, you absolutely are a hypocrite.
So I wrote something in 2007 called Boycott Veganism. And the thesis behind this is there are lots of ways to support violence. What we do economically is just one of many ways through which we can support violence. And to me, what matters is our net support for violence and not what we're doing in any particular concrete or discrete action. And I think if you look at the evidence as to what actually causes or alleviates violence against animals or suffering, it's usually not consumption habits one way or the other. So for example, in the anti-slavery movement, this is one of the arguments I make in Boycott Veganism, there was a huge movement called the Free Produce Society that was all about ensuring people would buy products that were not based on slavery. That movement was a complete failure. It did not free any slaves. It did not stop the suffering of any slaves, because it turns out the mechanism through which you actually stop the violence against the people who were held as chattel slaves in plantations across this country was mostly political and not economic. Your ability to actually affect this huge system involving, at the end of the Civil War, I think it was 4 million slaves in this country, by buying or not buying cotton that was produced at a plantation that had slaves or a plantation that didn't have slaves was minuscule. In fact, your ability to predict how that purchase would have any impact is very low. On the other hand, if you got politically active, you could make a very discrete and concrete impact on the liberation of other human beings. And I think the same is true of animals. When we buy or don't buy products, the causal impact on whether an animal suffers or dies is very attenuated. It might even be zero. It might have no impact at all. It's still important for us to be vegan for symbolic reasons. But if we're actually directly concerned, well, tell me why. I mean, if the political science and economic research suggest, and there's a Nobel Prize winner at University of Chicago called Robert Fogel who wrote a book about this and just combed through the literature and found that slavery was ultimately ended by a political movement. That all the people who were working in the Free Produce Society trying to change it was ended by war. The discrete, the proximate cause of the end of slavery was a civil war. But the root cause was a political movement that developed from the 1830s on. And it was about persuading people. It was about mobilizing people to oppose the system of slavery. And all the people who individually sat at their homes saying, I'm going to buy that free cotton. I'm going to buy that free sugar rather than the plantation sugar, probably didn't have much of an impact one way or the other on slaves. What ultimately ended it was a political movement. And I think the same is true of animal rights, that ultimately what's going to end the atrocities against animals is not whether someone buys vegan or non-vegan cat food. I think we should buy the vegan cat food if we can. What's going to end it is whether we can develop a political movement that changes the entire system. And so for that reason, I'm not that concerned or interested, and this is controversial, I'm not interested in whether animal rights activists are vegan or not. If we're successful at changing the entire system, everybody will be vegan, including the non-vegan animal rights activists. So our fundamental concern should be trying to get people active and supportive of the idea that what happens to animals is an atrocity. Will there be a lot of hypocrites? Absolutely. Richard Dawkins is a hypocrite. Maybe I'm a hypocrite for giving my cats non-vegan food my cat non-vegan food.
It's not maybe, you are.
Okay, well, fair enough. But ultimately, what I care about is not whether someone's a hypocrite or not, but are they alleviating the suffering of animals? And that question is not answered by whether someone's a hypocrite or not, but whether they're contributing to the movement to build political power to shut down all the factory farms and slaughterhouses across the country. What do you think of that?
So, if you were to lobby the government to ban animal agriculture, that would have a much bigger impact than the personal choice of not eating meat. That's not to say that personal choice doesn't have an impact. Again,
Yep,
you
I
can
agree.
do the math. Roughly 100 animals are saved if you choose not to eat meat. Roughly 100 per year. It's somewhere between 80, 120, something like that, give or take. So you could save the lives of 100 beings per year by making that personal choice. I don't know how you can hand wave away the significance of that by saying, well, it's not as good as outright banning animal agriculture. Like, if we were living in Nazi Germany,
Mhm.
would you say, well, I don't like the idea of killing Jews, but I'm more in favor of lobbying government than encouraging people to just individually not rat out Jews to the Gestapo or the SS. So I'm gonna not bother with this personal activism or
Gotcha. Yeah.
choice. And I know Anne Frank is living upstairs in my neighbor's bedroom, so I'm just gonna rat her out because
Mhm.
I know at the end of the day
I'm going to
it's
work
only
against the
one
policy. Yeah.
family. It's
Yeah.
only one family. So,
Yeah.
if like 8 people die, whatever, I'm just going to try to lobby the government and tell Hitler to, stop killing Jews. Hopefully that ends it all. We have a personal responsibility and your personal choices have an impact. So if you can save 100 lives per year, you're absolutely responsible for those
They're saying
deaths
those
if you
100
choose to
lives.
partake in
Yeah.
the industry.
Yeah. I think where I agree with you is that 100% that we should strive to be better and strive to not engage in rights violations. We should strive to save Anne Frank and at least not to hurt her and her family if we can.
Well, not
Where I
strive
might
to,
disagree with
you
you,
should do it.
you
You
should
you
do it.
should
You have
just
a
do it.
responsibility. I agree. I agree. So I misspoke. I shouldn't have said strive. I think we should just do it. We have, and not only should we do it, we have an obligation to do it. And it is appropriate for people to try and force us to do the right thing if we're not willing to do it ourselves. Now, granted, I think force should be done in with nonviolent means to the extent possible. But I do
Force
think
is by definition violent.
there's different types of force, right? Force is just energy that's used. So, for example, I can force my dog not to go after a squirrel, but I can do that violently and I can do that non-violently. I could pick my dog up and walk away and say, like, Oliver, please don't
That
hit the squirrel.
is even on that level an act of violence.
Fair enough.
That would be
Yeah.
like considered simple assault.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. And I'm not even disagreeing with you, but I'm just saying that there's a different
Well, and
type of
by the way,
force that we
there's
use.
a
Yeah.
threat of escalating force. Like, if I were to go speeding like on the highway, well, the
Yeah.
cops will pull me over, give me a ticket. Well, if I keep speeding, okay, well, now the cops are going to have to make a pit maneuver and
Mm-hmm.
have to run my car off the road. Well,
Mm-hmm.
if I run away, well, now they're going to have to come and chase me. Well, if I pull a gun out on them, well, now they're going to have to shoot me. Like, there's a threat of escalating force here. So
Sure.
when you talk about the use of nonviolence and using the most nonviolent approach possible, there's still the threat of escalating force that has to be there in order to keep society from behaving in the way that you want.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair. But to get back to the point I was trying to make, this question of systemic versus individual change, right? Where I said I agree with you is the fact that you're working on systemic change doesn't mean you just hand wave your individual contribution to a problem, right? I mean, it's not like you get a free pass to be racist or sexist or to be violent against someone just because you're trying to create a more peaceful world. That's not the way it works. But what I do think is important is in the long term for our North Star in terms of who we condemn, who we support, who we allocate resources to, who we take resources away from, is the question of what is systemically reducing the amount of violence. And to me, and I think the evidence shows this, a movement that excludes and focuses on condemning non-vegans who are trying to advocate for animals in some way is a movement that is not going to orient itself towards that North Star of reducing the total amount of violence and rights violations and suffering in the world. Because if we don't have the non-vegans with us in this movement will be weak. We will not change policy and will not change the world. Well, if we have the non-vegans with us, then the movement can do extraordinary things like ban fur in California, like prohibit factory farming in Sonoma County, like win cases that set precedents for the idea that animals are persons. These are all things that have happened with non-vegan support. And too often our movement is more concerned with condemning people as hypocrites or bad people, not concerned enough about how we can build political power to change the entire system. Is that fair?
Yeah, so I don't see that as being contradictory or like these goals oppose one another. You can condemn somebody while working with them to a political goal.
How do you prevent them from defecting from the movement if they're being condemned and feel kind of judged and isolated and excluded from the movement as a result of that condemnation?
You tell them not to be babies. So
see, the problem is
like,
that works for you, Richard. That's not going to work for most people.
Well, look, this happens all the time. Biden and Bernie butt heads all the time. Like right now in Israel, Palestine, Bernie is a huge Palestinian cuck. But they still work together politically. The liberals in the NDP party, they're butting heads right now, but they have like a pseudo coalition kind of right now. It's pretty common for political parties or political systems to disagree and condemn each other, but still work towards a common goal. I don't see how that really, condemning somebody or criticizing them is going to completely thwart any sort of, political action.
It's not going to thwart any political action. It's going to put up unnecessary obstacles. And I think what I'm talking about is not one specific statement by one important political figure like Biden against another political figure like Bernie. I'm talking about the culture of the entire movement. I think movements that have inclusive cultures, and this is something that Doug McAdam, the sociologist who studied the civil rights movement, has pointed to in the civil rights movement. When the civil rights movement in the 1960s was very focused on condemning white people for being racist, or even black people for not being sufficiently supportive of the civil rights movement, it wasn't very successful. Well, when it had a Big Tent approach and said, look, most people are going to be racist. They're going to be even black people and people of color who are not willing to take the risks that someone like King or the Freedom Riders or the Freedom Summer activists have. But we have to have a big tent and make sure everyone feels like they're part of our team. And a culture where you're too focused on purity politics and condemning people for being imperfect, because we're all imperfect. I'm a hypocrite. I'm going to admit that. You've admitted yourself that one of the reasons you were more open to animal rights was because you saw bad things in yourself and you're willing to reflect, which is amazing, right? We have to create a culture where everyone has a space to do that. And while I wish everyone were as tough as you, honestly, and willing to be, for example, even a persona non grata in a movement and continue to do the activism, most people are not like you, Richard. Even Gary, who I think you and I would both probably say is a pretty tough guy, this movement became a toxic place for him because everyone was just shouting at him for being a racist instead of realizing he has got a lot to offer. So I even think a lot of the criticisms of Gary were true. Like, he made mistakes. I think he probably had positions that I don't agree with and I think were morally wrong. Nonetheless, he had enormous amounts to offer the movement. And I say the same with the non-vegans, not to compare non-vegan to Gary, because I think, they're very different cases. Nonetheless, I think non-vegans have a lot to offer this movement and we have to create a more inclusive space. And often that means not condemning them because the average person is not going to be as resilient as you and face a lot of criticism and hate and judgment and still stick around. Is that fair?
Yeah. I don't know how you can have an animal rights movement where we don't condemn meat eating. Like, that's the logical problem that I have. Like, if we were going to have, I don't know, some like sort of rights movement in Nazi Germany, like to, be against the segregation of Jews, like, are we really going to include like rabid anti-Semites into our movement? There has to be some level of condemnation. So again, I just don't see it as being practical to just say, oh, it's fine eating meat. It's a personal choice. It's a journey. Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the position. And actually, Ezra Klein made the same argument when I had him on the podcast, my prior podcast a long time ago, that, I mean, how do you have a movement for animal rights where people are literally consuming the bodies of slaughtered animals? There has to be some internal consistency. Otherwise, there's no credibility. Like the personal is the
Yeah.
political, right? You can't. And my answer to that is, I think we should condemn eating meat. I just think we have to condemn the other side of the coin. It's not so much the eating of the meat that's a problem. It's the killing of the animal. It's the violence against the animal. And you might say, well, you're just playing a game of smoke and mirrors. It's the same damn thing. And to a certain extent, that's true. But I think even if you look at kind of the way people respond to a ban on slaughterhouses, right? Have you seen the polling data showing that 1 in 2 Americans want to ban slaughterhouses?
Yeah.
It's mind blowing. Because,
Yeah.
all these people are saying, yeah, let's ban slaughterhouses, are paying for the slaughter of animals. It's like, how is this possible? But if you do the same polling and ask people, should we require people to eat vegan and vegetarian? They all say no, right? So to me, it's both strategically and just philosophically, it's important to invert the framing of condemning meat eating towards the violence against animals and away from the individual consumption. Now, it means the same thing effectively, because if we ban slaughterhouses and we tell people we can't support the slaughter of animals, then it means people have to be vegan, right? Because we know there's a lot of slaughter of animals, including in dairy and egg production. There's a huge amount of slaughter of animals in dairy and egg production. But just inverting the framing, or not even inverting the framing, inverting is not the right word. It's just taking the flip side of that same coin is going to make our arguments much more sympathetic. Or at least that's my take. I could be wrong. I don't know. Yeah, sorry I let you down, Richard. I'm a little bit of a hypocrite on my cat.
Yeah. Don't ever do that again, or I'll come after you.
How are you going to come after me?
Well, I can travel. I don't have a criminal record.
That's true. You can come after me. Well, I don't intend to do that again, Richard, because I don't think I'm not planning to adopt a cat anytime soon, and dogs are not obligate carnivores, and it's pretty easy for them to be vegan. So, yeah. We've been going for an hour and 51 minutes, my friend, and this has been a lot of fun. But I think we should wrap things up. Is there any final thoughts, anything kind of on your mind that you think is important for animal advocates or even non-animal advocates who are watching this to think about? You've definitely provoked me to think about a lot of things, even in the last hour and 50 minutes. But what else has been on your mind recently?
Yeah, just the big issue with fake vegans. Like if you go on any vegan forums, you'll see a bunch of people coping about feeding cats and dogs meat. Especially cats. It's a big hot button issue, and even you've fed your cat meat. So I think you need to be. I think you need to understand your values, and actually follow them and do the right thing, and not just think of the animal that's in front of you that lives in your home. You should think of the other animals that will have to suffer and die because of your choices to feed your companion animal meat. It can be sad seeing animals suffer and like die slowly. It's a bad thing, but other animals have to go through that, if not even worse, in the agriculture industry. So if you're ever thinking of feeding your cat or dog meat, don't.
Think about them too.
Because if you do, you're a scumbag.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this. I appreciate that critique, Richard. And what I like even more than what you said about that, which I think is a fair critique, like I said, is your point about cooperating and working together to stop the atrocities against animals, no matter what positions we take on something like vegan cats. And I've always appreciated your independence, your willingness to say things that you believe are true. I think that's part of building good movements too. But one of those true things you said is, at the end of the day, we got to work together. You've got to work together with anyone who's going to support us. And I'll continue to work together with you,
no
matter what disagreements we have about predators or vegan cats. And I don't even think our positions are that different.
And I would say that's a problem just for people in general. I've seen it a lot in every political movement, but in veganism as well, people are refusing to work with other people because of political differences. There's a lot of people that I've butted heads with that I don't particularly like. Like I've had issues with Joey Carbstrong. I'd still be willing to support his work and even work with him for a common goal if he were willing to do so. So I think more people should have that attitude where even if you don't like somebody, even if you butt heads and disagree politically, if you have a common goal, just put your differences aside and work towards that common goal.
Wise words end with, and for the record, Joey's amazing. You're amazing, Richard. And you
Oh, thanks.
give everyone food for thought, including me. So I appreciate it. Until next time, my friend.
All right.